There are towns where winter isn't just a season, but a warning. A place where loss lingers in the snow and secrets drift just beneath the surface. In Truckee, a widowed officer and a broken rescue dog were meant to start over. But one blood-stained child's jacket changed everything. What would you risk for a stranger's life, or for a dog's trust, when the whole world seems against you? What darkness still waits in the woods, unseen? Before we start, tell me where you're watching from. Winter was never gentle in Truckee, California. It came down the spine of the Sierra Nevada with a force that seemed older than memory, blanketing every gabled rooftop and narrow alley in a hush that pressed at the windows, flattening all sound. By the second week of December, the whole town braced beneath a quilt of hard-packed snow. Plows scraped through Main Street at dawn. The yellow glow of street lamps flickered on even at noon, their halos fuzzy in the drifting white. Time moved slow, like breath caught between heartbeats. For newcomers, Truckee was a picture postcard, a clapboard town ringed by pine forest and ancient mountains, nestled near Donner Lake. For the old-timers, it was a place where stories burrowed deep, where secrets settled under the snow and never quite thawed out, even in spring. That December, the silence was deeper than usual. Officer Clay Henderson arrived in that hush, his footsteps muffled by slush and regret. At 42, he wore his grief like a second skin, a man carved out by loss, the lines at his eyes mapped by too many sleepless nights. The journey from Minnesota had been long and wordless. He drove west alone, possessions packed with military neatness, the empty seat beside him echoing the ache of what he'd left behind. His wife's photo, sunlit hair, the laugh frozen mid-breath, tucked deep in his wallet, a secret he could barely look at. Truckee was supposed to be a kind of surrender, or maybe a last stand. He wasn't sure which. His new badge felt heavy on his chest, its number still unfamiliar beneath his fingertips. The sheriff's station was squat and wood-framed, perched just outside the town's oldest quarter, its parking lot glazed with ice. Clay arrived before sunrise, the sky a dim bruise, and was greeted by a silence that seemed to press on his eardrums. Inside, the station was all battered desks, ringing phones, coffee burnt down to bitterness. Captain Leah Bronson, tall, steady, hair streaked with iron and snow, met him with a handshake that lingered just long enough to take his measure. Her voice was clipped, her posture the kind you see in people who have known too much disappointment to expect miracles. "You'll get used to the quiet," she told him. "Some folks never do." There were others, dispatchers with stories behind their eyes, patrolmen who nodded but didn't ask questions, a young officer named Will Drummond, who moved with the nervous energy of someone trying too hard to matter. Clay took it all in without speaking much. He unpacked his duffel in a small, cold room above the station, unpacked his silences, let the grief settle into the cracks between the walls. His new partner waited downstairs. Sable was a German shepherd, 6 years old, his coat dark as the mountain's shadow after sunset. He had the angular beauty of a working dog, all tense muscle and lean, cautious intelligence. But it was his eyes that haunted. Deep amber, ringed in black, always watching, always measuring. The files said Sable came from Colorado, from rescue teams and mountains and one unspeakable mission gone wrong. No one in Truckee spoke of it directly, but the whisper trailed Sable's name like fog. Lost someone. Saw things. Changed. Their first meeting was wordless, Sable stood in his kennel, stiff-legged but silent, eyes locked on Clay's. There was no greeting, no tail wag, just an unbroken line of sight. A question, an accusation, maybe a plea for understanding. Clay crouched slowly, keeping his hands open, palms out. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the heater, the sigh of wind against frosted glass. Sable watched, unmoving, a flicker of memory trapped behind his eyes. Clay felt something shift, a quiet recognition. They were both survivors of something that couldn't be spoken. Days passed in a gray hush. Clay learned the shape of the town, the sagging porches strung with tired Christmas lights, the cracked ice on Donner Lake, the smell of pine and wood smoke in the pre-dawn air. Sable moved with him, a shadow at his side, always alert, always slightly apart. At night, Clay stared out his window at the sweep of white, listened to the wind shudder in the eaves, wondered what it meant to start again when your heart was still somewhere else. He noticed things. Sable slept lightly, sometimes rising in the small hours to stand at the door, ears pricked toward the unseen. Sometimes the dog would stare into the dark, a low growl building in his chest, body tense as if remembering something only he could sense. Clay never spoke to the others about it. He understood what it was to carry ghosts. On his third morning, Clay stood by the station window as the first light crawled over the pines, his breath fogging the glass. Sable lay at his feet, eyes half closed but not asleep. The world was silent, waiting. Out there, somewhere beyond the hush of snow and sorrow, something was about to change. Neither man nor dog could know how quickly the past would find them, or how their pain would become the key to saving what little hope this frozen town still had left. The snow had settled so thickly on Donner Lake that it seemed to mute even the possibility of trouble. Pine boughs sagged beneath the weight. The ice at the shore cracked with ancient patience, shifting beneath a hush that pressed down on everything, on the small wooden houses lining the main road, on the battered signs for ski rentals and hardware stores, on the lives of people doing their best to forget whatever they'd lost last year, or the year before that. Clay and Sable set out before dawn, breath clouding in the brittle cold. The patrol car, an aging Tahoe, rumbled slowly through narrow streets, tires crunching on refrozen slush. Clay kept the radio low, one hand resting on the wheel, the other occasionally reaching down to stroke Sable's head. The silence between them was heavy, but not unfriendly. There was a kind of comfort in having a companion who understood how little words could do to mend the cracks. They made their rounds. School zone, still empty but for the janitor's truck. Main Street, with its bakery window glowing gold against the gray. A sweep past the train depot where nothing moved but the drift of snow under the platform lights. Clay found himself watching for things that didn't belong, signs that the world could break open at any moment, as it once had for him. As they neared the old footpath that curled along the northern edge of Donner Lake, Sable shifted. His ears flattened, then snapped up, nose pressed against the cold glass. The dog began to whine, a low, urgent note that made Clay's hand freeze midair. He slowed the car, gaze following the shepherd's fixed stare. The forest beyond the trailhead was a tangle of white and black, skeletal trees marching down to the edge of the lake. Sable's body tensed, vibrating with some current Clay could only guess at. The dog let out a single, clipped bark. Clay felt his pulse skip. He stopped the car and stepped out. Boots crunching on snow, the air so cold it made his teeth ache. Sable bounded out before Clay could leash him, nose down, paws kicking up powder as he tore across the verge and onto the path. There was nothing for a long moment but the hush of the wind and Clay's own breath. Then, a flash of color, jarring against the white. Sable stood rigid by the trunk of a gnarled pine, muzzle close to a dark shape, half buried in the snow. Clay hurried over, heart thudding. It was a child's jacket, bright red, sleeve torn, splotched with something dark and stiff. Blood. The world seemed to constrict, sound dropping away. Clay crouched, his gloves trembling as he turned the fabric over. There were tiny buttons shaped like cartoon bears, one ripped half off. He swallowed hard, every muscle rigid. Sable paced a tight circle, head low, eyes flicking back and forth from the jacket to the woods beyond. The radio crackled, sudden and loud against the silence. "Unit 3, come in. Officer Henderson, do you copy?" Clay jerked, fumbled for the mic. "Go ahead." The dispatcher's voice was thin, brittle with something close to panic. "We've got a missing child alert. 10-year-old boy, Benji Salazar. Went sledding yesterday afternoon near the lake. Never came home. Parents reported him missing just now. He's wearing a red jacket. Local search parties have started, but we need all available units." Clay looked down at the jacket in his hands, then at Sable, whose body was trembling, tail low, ears tracking every distant sound. He pressed the button, forcing his voice to hold steady. "Copy that. I'm at Donner Lake Trailhead. Found a red child's jacket with blood. Request backup and medical, over." He clipped the mic back and rose, feeling his vision sharpen to a cold, ruthless clarity. This was the moment. The world splitting along old fault lines. The safe routines breaking open to show what lay underneath. Sable whined, then bolted suddenly to the edge of the clearing, nose pressed to the snow, paws digging. Clay followed, adrenaline burning through his fatigue. The snow was disturbed, a patchwork of prints, small boots, sliding, and chillingly, the deeper marks of a dragging weight. Overlapping, larger boot prints, an adult's, ran parallel, circling, then veering sharply toward the trees. Clay knelt, his gloved hand hovering just above the scuffed snow. The prints were fresh enough to hold the outline of tread, but already the wind was beginning to blur their edges. Sable's whole body was tight as a bowstring, muscles quivering, the air around him charged. He started to whimper, a sound of warning, of memory. Clay felt a shiver that was more than cold. He took a long, careful look at the path, the way it twisted toward the dense woods, the way the snow lay rough and broken where someone or something had been dragged away. He stood, one hand resting on Sable's neck, grounding himself in the dog's steady heat. The patrol car's lights flashed blue against the white, a distant promise of help. But the trees seemed to swallow the color, leaving only gray shadow. Clay felt the town's old stories gathering at his back. Children gone missing, footprints vanishing into the endless snow, the hush that followed as everyone tried to forget. Sable turned, fixing Clay with a gaze that was both plea and command. For a heartbeat, everything stilled, the world balancing on a knife's edge between hope and disaster. Far away, the dispatcher's voice buzzed again, but Clay barely heard it. In that suspended moment, something inside him cracked, the old grief shifting, making room for something fiercer, the will to act, to risk himself again, no matter what was lost last time. And somewhere just beyond the reach of sight, the woods waited, silent and patient as the past itself. The red jacket weighed in Clay's hands, heavier than any evidence bag he'd ever carried. He stood beneath the shivering pine, snow sifting over his shoulders, as if the world meant to bury the moment before anyone could really look at it. Sable nosed the ground, whining low, tail flicking in agitation. The child's scent was sharp, alive beneath the iron tang of old blood and winter rot. The trail pressed into the woods, raw, broken, already threatened by drifting snow. Other officers arrived in scattered pairs, moving with the strained urgency of people who'd prayed nothing bad ever happened here. Flashlights swept the undergrowth, boots crunched through brittle drifts, and radio voices cut the hush in thin, anxious lines. Clay watched the search gather shape. Volunteers in thick coats, neighbors, a local pastor, all holding their breath together, their hope growing smaller with every passing hour. But the hope was mostly for the parents. Clay knew that. He had learned the way people's faces change when hope thins. He remembered it in the way his wife's doctors lowered their eyes. He saw it now in Mrs. Salazar, who arrived on foot, her gloves lost, hair wild, eyes hollow with fear. Her husband tried to keep her back, voice trembling with both anger and love, but the cold wind swallowed their words. Clay made himself a silent shadow in the edges, taking notes, marking times, letting the others do the searching, while Sable did what only he could. The dog moved methodically, circling, stopping to sniff at a half-buried mitten and the scattered crumbs of a granola bar, details that would mean nothing to anyone but a child out far too late in the cold. The deeper the search went, the more Clay sensed the distance between himself and the town's old guard. He felt it in the way Captain Bronson's glance sometimes lingered, curious, measuring, never quite sure whether he was here to help or to haunt old wounds. Inside the station, heat throbbed from ancient radiators. Clay filed his report, handwriting neat from years of habit, fingers numb. Sable paced the length of the squad room, nails ticking on faded linoleum, pausing at each window to stare into the whiteout beyond. The other officers talked in low voices, their conversation a mixture of frustration and hope, though already suspicion began to coil beneath the words. Some muttered about strangers in town, some worried out loud about the old logging roads, the kind that twisted deep into the hills where no search parties dared to go after dark. Captain Bronson called Clay into her office. The walls were covered with maps, thumbtacks, photos from years of charity parades and blizzards survived. She sat rigid, posture ramrod straight, the only warmth in the room coming from a battered mug in her hand. "You sure Sable's not just reliving something?" she asked, voice carefully neutral. "These rescue dogs, sometimes the old traumas get triggered. You know that, Henderson." Clay met her gaze, trying to find the line between respect and the quiet defiance that had kept him going all these years. He found the jacket. He's tracking. He knows the difference. Bronson exhaled, a long, slow breath. "You're new. People talk. Sable's got a record for heroics, but also for unpredictability. I want you to keep him on a short leash. There's no need to panic the town. We'll call in Forest Service for backup, but let's keep the lid on for now." He nodded, feeling the distance between himself and her stretch further. Not anger exactly. Something older. Fatigue, maybe, or fear of looking straight at the worst possibilities. That night, Clay brought Sable to his quarters above the station. The room felt smaller, lonelier in the blue wash of the streetlights, his shadow long and doubled on the wall. He tried to sleep, But the images kept returning. The red jacket, the prints in the snow, the helplessness in Mrs. Salazar's eyes. He rolled onto his side, arm draped over the edge of the bed, fingers tangled in Sable's coarse fur. The dog lay awake, breathing slow but never quite at rest. Wind howled through the eaves. From somewhere in the building came the slow, rhythmic ticking of an old clock. Clay listened to the heartbeat of the station, its steady, exhausted pulse, and wondered what darkness might have found a home in a town like this. He rose before dawn, unable to lie still. Coffee percolated in the silence. Sable sat at the window, watching. Snow continued to fall, endless, erasing the prints, swallowing the trail. Clay's phone buzzed with updates, none of them hopeful. The search had found nothing overnight. As he buttoned his uniform, Sable stiffened, ears pricked, nose twitching. The dog padded to the door, tail rigid, and barked once, sharper than before, a warning shot into the hush. Clay frowned, peered down the dim hallway. Nothing moved, but on the threshold, slipped between the door and the frame, was a folded scrap of paper, its edges creased with cold. He stooped, opening it. The message was written in blocky, uneven lines. "Don't trust everyone. The woods hide more than snow." The station was silent, a hush thick with secrets. Sable pressed his body to Clay's leg, eyes bright and unblinking, waiting for a sign. The world outside had never seemed so wide or so close to breaking open. Dawn came reluctantly. A thin gray veil dragged across the peaks, turning the snow outside to hammered silver. Most of Truckee was still asleep. Only the bakery on Main sent curls of warm, yeasty air out into the brittle cold. In the small kitchen above the station, Clay Henderson sat at the edge of a hard chair, shoulders hunched, watching Sable watch the door. The dog hadn't slept all night. Every few minutes he'd rise, pad softly from window to window, pause, listen, nose pressed to the gap in the glass. It was as if some silent alarm only he could hear was ringing through the bones of the town. The message weighed on Clay's mind. Don't trust everyone. The woods hide more than snow. The words had no signature, no hint of who had written them, but they buzzed with urgency, a charge in the air that set Clay's nerves on edge. He folded the note small, tucked it into his breast pocket, and watched the room grow lighter by slow degrees. The world outside the frosted glass was a silent stage, the fresh snow concealing whatever stories had played out during the night. Sable refused his breakfast, something that had never happened before. The dog paced the narrow room, muscles taut, eyes never quite resting. Clay recognized the signs, the old trauma surfacing maybe, or the sharp intuition of an animal who lived by patterns and scents and the memory of things unseen. Clay sipped his coffee in silence, feeling a restlessness that had no name. He could have reported the message, could have brought it to Captain Bronson, but something in him resisted. There was a subtle undercurrent in the station these days, a glancing suspicion, a way eyes slid past each other in the halls, the soft hush of conversations that ended the moment he entered a room. He remembered how quickly doubt could close ranks, remembered what it was like to be the outsider who saw too much. By 6 a.m., he'd made up his mind. He dressed quietly, layering fleece beneath his uniform, clipped Sable's leash to his harness, and slipped out into the pale hush before sunrise. The sky was clouded, a thick, motionless gray that blurred the edges of everything. The only sound was the crunch of their boots and paws in the snow. They cut through side streets to the edge of town, then skirted the edge of Donner Lake, following the path they'd walked yesterday, past the Red Jackets' resting place and the fading tracks. Sable moved with a strange urgency, head low, nose working the snow in restless, tight circles. The world narrowed to the rhythm of their breath, the cold stinging at Clay's eyes, the sound of wind and the slow, irregular thud of his own heart. The trail was nearly gone, erased by the night's storm. But Sable found something. First a sliver of bright yarn tangled on a low branch, then a small blue mitten pressed flat in the snow, a child's name stitched inside in faded thread. Benji. Clay swallowed, fighting the instinct to call for backup, to wait for reinforcements. The weight of the note burned in his chest. He pushed deeper into the woods. Soon the trees pressed close, trunks crowding, snow mounded in deep drifts beneath them. Sable tugged hard at the leash, breath steaming, leading Clay along a faint game trail that twisted between rocks and fallen logs. Then, suddenly, the forest opened up to a small, frozen clearing. At its far edge, hunched among leaning pines and half buried beneath snow, stood an old cabin, one of those weathered relics left behind by long-gone trappers or forgotten squatters. Smoke no longer rose from its battered stovepipe, but a ring of stones suggested a fire had burned there recently. Clay crouched, touching the ashes. Still warm, a faint smudge of black on his glove. Sable circled, nose to the ground, and stopped dead in front of the door, hackles raised, tail stiff. He began to bark, not the warning bark, but a frantic, sharp cry, claws raking at the rough boards beside the jam. Clay moved to the door. It was padlocked. The metal rusted, but the lock itself new, the sort a careful person buys when they don't expect anyone to look closely. He stepped back, scanning the area. Child-sized footprints, old but clear, led to the stoop, mixed with the deeper indentations of adult boots. Bits of red and blue fabric caught in the doorframe, a small army figurine half buried in the drift. Sable whined, pawing at a loose board. Clay knelt, working his fingers beneath the edge. The wood gave suddenly, splinters biting into his palm. Behind the board, stuffed deep into the space between the logs, he found a plastic bag. Inside, 2 items, a string of rainbow-colored beads, snapped at one end, and a small folding knife streaked with something dark and dry. His pulse hammered. The evidence was too raw, too specific to ignore. Sable pressed close, breathing hard, eyes wild, as if he could smell the echo of fear in the cabin walls. On the back of the door, scratched in with a jagged hand, someone had written, "Don't let them take me. They come at night." Clay felt a cold shudder run through him that had nothing to do with the snow. He looked down at Sable, who stared back, as if pleading with him to understand that something terrible still moved through these woods, hungry and unafraid. Somewhere, far off, a raven croaked in the thinning light. Clay gathered the bag and the beads, the mitten, and the memory of ashes still warm. He didn't call it in, not yet. Some instinct deeper than protocol told him this was only the beginning, and the woods around Truckee were holding their breath, waiting to see what he would do next. Back at the station, the world seemed somehow smaller, as if the walls had drawn closer, their quiet, chipped paint holding more secrets than the woods themselves. Clay moved through the corridors like someone trespassing in their own life. Sable pressed close to his knee, the dog's head swinging warily at every closed door. Clay's boots left a trail of half-melted snow from the rear entrance all the way to the evidence room. He logged the discoveries with practiced precision. Blue mitten, beads, folding knife, each placed carefully into bags, labels scrawled in his steady, blocky print. His fingers trembled only once, when he pressed the Submit button on the department computer, attaching photos and notes. The screen flickered, briefly showing his files uploading to the case server. He paused at the window, watching snow swirl under the lot's halogen lights. He thought of the cabin's message, "They come at night," and of the warmth lingering in the ashes, a heat that had no business still burning after so many hours. Sable paced restlessly, tail low, eyes fixed on the far side of the room, where the old file cabinets cast long, doubled shadows. Captain Bronson found him in the hallway, her posture rigid, every inch the career officer. "You find something?" Her tone was even, clipped. Neither trust nor skepticism, just the measured voice of authority. He handed her the bagged items, met her gaze. "I think Benji was in that cabin. I think someone else was, too. There are fresh tracks in that lock. Someone doesn't want anybody looking close." Bronson weighed the evidence, her eyes moving over each object in turn. For a heartbeat, Clay thought he saw something break in her calm, a flicker of worry, of remembered loss. "I'll have these processed," she said. "But the press can't get wind of this. No panic. Not until we know more." Clay nodded, even as unease bit at him. He could feel Sable's tension humming up through the leash, the dog glancing toward the closed office doors, nostrils flaring. Afternoon darkened into early evening, and Clay sat at his desk, a mug of burnt coffee untouched. He watched the station move around him in fits and starts. Officers shuffling papers, dispatchers fielding calls about icy roads, a janitor whistling flatly as he swept. The old clock on the wall ticked louder than any voice. Time dragged. Restless, he checked his report status on the department computer. Case number 457, new evidence, Benji Salazar. But the file wouldn't open. He refreshed, waited, tried again. Nothing. Just a blank screen, cursor blinking, like the machine was thinking about whether to answer. He dug deeper into the folder structure. The photo attachments, gone. His notes, empty. The entire submission had vanished, erased as though he'd never entered it. His heart pounded. He scanned the log. No record of upload, no traces in sent mail. It wasn't a glitch. Someone had wiped the evidence. Down the corridor, Sable whined sharply and lurched to his feet. His body angled toward the evidence room, hackles up, teeth bared in a silent snarl. Clay followed, muscles taut, the sense of being watched sharpening to a blade. He reached the storage room in time to catch a flash of motion, a figure slipping away around the corner, footsteps too quick, too light for one of the older officers. Clay followed, footsteps silent on the linoleum, hand hovering above his radio. In the gloom near the side exit, he caught a glimpse. Officer Will Drummond, the rookie, his face flushed and eyes wide, one gloved hand stuffed deep in his jacket pocket. The smell of earth clung to him, something dark and metallic on his sleeve. A streak of what might have been mud or blood, though there was no wound Clay could see. Will startled, eyes flicking to Clay, then down to Sable, whose low, guttural growl was the only sound in the hall. For an instant, guilt or fear or something more tangled flashed behind Will's eyes, and then he forced a thin, uncertain smile. "Hey, you working late too?" His voice cracked with a forced lightness. Clay said nothing. The air between them stretched thin as glass. Will hesitated, then moved off quickly, disappearing toward the locker room. Sable surged forward, but Clay held him back, heart drumming with suspicion and something colder, older, an instinct he'd learned to trust in the army and lost too many times since. He turned back to the evidence room. The computer's monitor had gone black. No sign of the report, no backup in the local files, just the soft hum of the server, the steady thump of Sable's tail against his boot, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. Night descended with sudden force, draping the town in blue and black. Clay locked up and took Sable upstairs. Sleep, when it came, was thin and uneasy. Sable kept to the window, eyes on the snowy alley behind the station, body rigid. Just past midnight, the dog let out a wild, frantic barking, leaping up to scratch at the glass. Clay bolted upright, adrenaline sharp. He peered out through the swirling snow, heart hammering. There, just visible in the cone of a distant streetlight, was a shadow, human-sized, dragging something heavy, moving deeper into the woods. The shape vanished before Clay could focus, but Sable's reaction said everything. The threat wasn't gone. It was only waiting, somewhere out in the cold. It snowed again that night, and by morning the whole world was reset. The tracks and the fears and the warnings all pressed beneath a layer of fresh, glittering silence. In the pre-dawn hush, Clay sat in his room, boots on. The laces knotted and re-knotted, as if his hands didn't know what else to do. Sable lay on the rug, not sleeping, not at ease, eyes flicking from window to door, as if he expected something to burst through either one at any moment. Official orders came down. "Stand down, Officer Henderson. We'll coordinate with the Forest Service. No independent action." The message was polite, almost gentle, but it rang false. There was a chill behind the words, a subtle threat layered beneath professionalism. Clay read it twice, then tossed his phone face down on the bed. He was used to being left out in the cold, literally and otherwise. He spent the morning restlessly circling the perimeter of the station, waiting for any sign that the others were actually searching, actually following up. But the search parties were a formality, more theater than substance, and by noon, the energy had already drained from the operation. The snow kept falling. The world kept closing in. Sable wouldn't settle. The dog barked at every sound in the hallway, pawed at the door, whined at the smallest flicker of movement outside. Clay watched him, reading the old panic in the animal's stiff spine, the memories buried beneath fur and instinct. There was a history in Sable's eyes, a record of things lost and never recovered. Clay felt an old kinship, two creatures living on the aftershock of things they could not forget. That afternoon, Clay made his decision. He waited until the station grew quiet, the others lulled by the routine of paperwork and coffee, by the comforting lie that nothing bad ever happened in towns like this. He grabbed his coat, checked the spare batteries in his flashlight, and clipped the leash onto Sable's harness. They slipped out the side door just as a drift of heavy snow muffled the last of the daylight. Clay didn't call for backup. He didn't leave a note. There was only the message folded in his pocket, Sable's anxious pacing, and a hunch that something was coiling itself around the town, tightening its grip each time someone looked away. Sable led the way. It was always the dog who knew where to start, a sixth sense for tragedy and terror. They cut through the back lot, past the empty sledding hill and the frozen pond ringed with silent swings. Clay's breath was ragged, each exhale billowing in the cold. The hush of falling snow pressed down, dampening every step. There were no tracks, no sign of life but for the crow that circled overhead, its call sharp as a wound. The woods at the town's edge were thick and dark, the trees standing shoulder to shoulder in the twilight. Sable moved quickly, nose close to the ground, ears cocked. Clay stumbled after, ducking branches heavy with ice, feeling the ache in his knees, the old pain where a bone never quite healed right. They passed the cabin again, now seemingly abandoned. Door closed, lock dangling from the latch, the warmth of yesterday gone as if it had never existed. Sable barely paused, circling the clearing once before pushing deeper into the forest, along a game trail that twisted and narrowed until it was little more than a tunnel through the undergrowth. After 20 minutes, the path opened onto another, broader trail, a place Clay recognized only vaguely from old county maps, marked as a service road but unused for years. There, half hidden by the branches, was a battered sedan parked nose first against a snowbank. Its windows were fogged from the inside. The license plate was dusted with ice, but Clay brushed it clear, memorizing the numbers. Sable's hackles rose. He pressed his nose to the car's rear door, then jerked back, ears flattened, teeth bared in a soundless snarl. Clay peered through the window and saw movement. A figure inside, slumped low, face barely visible in the gloom. The man looked up, startled by the flashlight's beam, and for a second, their eyes locked. He was young, mid-20s, pale, with a jagged scar along one cheek and a frightened, hunted look. Clay pounded on the window. "Truckee police, step out of the vehicle." The man hesitated, glancing at something in his lap. Then, with a jerk, he flung open the door and bolted, slipping, scrambling, vanishing into the thicket. Sable lunged, leash taut, body rigid with the urge to chase. Clay knelt and checked the car's interior, a tangle of dirty blankets, a child's backpack in the back seat, and on the floor, a black duffel bag gaping open. Inside were bundles of cash, rolls of tape, and a battered phone. Its screen cracked but blinking with messages, times, addresses, and names. The last message read, "Meet at the old logging camp. Midnight. Bring the kid." His heart seized. Clay gathered the backpack, quickly rifling through its pockets. Inside, a library card. Benji Salazar. A wave of dread swept through him. A sudden, sick certainty. Behind him, Sable snarled, then let out a long chew. Mournful howl that cut through the trees and echoed back, as if the whole forest were listening. The cold thickened. Clay felt the weight of the evidence in his hands, the ache of old loss burning in his chest. He knew then that the missing boy was still out there, alive maybe for now, but not for long if he didn't move quickly. There was no going back. The official search was over, but the real one had just begun. Night in the high Sierras had a way of swallowing everything, light, hope, the faintest trace of warmth. Clay stood alone in the frozen hush, Sable's breath fogging the air beside him, the only sound his own blood pounding in his ears. He cradled Benji's backpack against his chest, the rough nylon damp with melting snow, as if holding the small, ordinary object could anchor him in a world gone strange. The phone from the duffel bag glowed in his gloved palm. Meet at the old logging camp. Midnight. Bring the kid. The words burned with urgency, thick with threat. Somewhere in these woods, a deal was being made, a life traded for money or silence, and only Sable seemed to know how close the danger truly was. Clay didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, phone and backpack shoved into his pack, flashlight bouncing over drifts and fallen logs. Sable moved ahead, body arrow straight, nose down, leading with a surety that came from 100 rescues and 1,000 remembered terrors. There was no turning back to the station, no calling for backup that might never come. All that was left was the narrow beam of Clay's light and the dog's urgent momentum. The old logging camp lay on the far edge of the forest, where the land sloped steep and treacherous toward the canyon. Trucks and heavy equipment sat rusting in the gloom, their hulks half swallowed by snow and shadow. Sable slowed at the edge of the clearing, tail stiff, hackles high. Clay crouched low, scanning the line of derelict buildings, a long, low shed, the skeleton of a loader, a shack with its door ajar. He heard them before he saw them, voices, low and muffled, drifting on the wind. A man, angry, barking orders, another, younger, pleading. Then the sharp, muffled cry of a child, instantly stifled. Clay's heart jolted, a cold shot of adrenaline burning away fatigue. He crept closer, keeping to the dark. Sable pressed at his leg, breath warm on Clay's wrist, the dog's whole body trembling with focus. In the open bay of the shed, Clay spotted 3 figures, 2 men, 1 small child bundled in a blue parka, hands bound in front. The man from the sedan, the one with the scar, was arguing with another, taller, heavier, his face obscured by a wool cap pulled low. "Money's short. Boss wants the kid gone tonight. He's seen too much." Clay's vision narrowed. He reached for his radio, thumb poised to transmit, then remembered the static on the department channel, the silence that had greeted his calls all afternoon. No one would come in time. Sable tensed, ears flat, a low growl rolling in his chest. The noise was barely audible, but the scarred man spun, squinting into the dark. Clay acted without thinking. He hurled a rock against the far side of the shed, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Both men turned, weapons drawn, an old revolver and a length of pipe. In that heartbeat of confusion, Clay surged forward, Sable at his heel. The fight was brutal, desperate. The scarred man lunged, pipe swinging for Clay's head. Clay ducked, the blow glancing off his shoulder. Sable barreled into the attacker's knees, teeth snapping, a blur of fur and rage. The man howled, twisting away. Clay tackled the larger man, wrenching the revolver from his grasp, both men crashing into the snow. The cold stung every inch of exposed skin. Clay's breaths came ragged, his vision flickering at the edges. Sable grappled with the first man, the two of them locked in a savage, rolling struggle that churned the snow red and gray. Clay drove his elbow into the second man's jaw, forcing him down, pinning him long enough to snatch the gun and toss it clear. Benji, silent and wide-eyed, sat curled beside the loader, hands still tied. Clay crawled to him, knife already in hand, sawing through the rope. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice cracking. "We're getting you home." But it wasn't over. The scarred man broke free of Sable's jaws, staggering to his feet, pipe raised. Sable, limping now, blood on his shoulder, placed himself between the man and the boy, eyes wild with pain and defiance. For a long second, all movement stilled. The wind rose, howling through the empty camp. Then headlights swung across the clearing. Another vehicle, engine roaring. Clay saw, too late, a third man leap from the driver's seat, gun drawn, shouting orders. "Get the kid! Get in the car!" Sable lunged, teeth bared. Clay dove for Benji, shoving the boy behind a stack of pallets. The gun barked. Snow exploded inches from Sable's flank. Clay fired back, the revolver's shot ringing out into the dark. Somewhere, someone screamed. It was chaos. Panic and noise. The thin line between victory and tragedy razor-sharp. Clay kept firing, kept shouting Benji's name, kept watching Sable, who fought with the fury of a wounded wolf and the devotion of a friend who refused to give up. At last, police sirens wailed through the trees. Captain Bronson, against all orders, racing up the old service road, blue lights burning away the night. The kidnappers scattered, two collapsing in the snow, one vanishing into the brush. Sable limped to Benji's side, pressing his battered head into the boy's hands. Clay knelt in the snow, heart pounding, breath ragged, arms around them both. For a moment, everything went still. The only sound was the wind and the desperate, grateful sob of a child who was finally safe. The sound of sirens tore the silence apart, flashing blue against the storm-laced trees as more squad cars churned up the logging road, wheels slipping on the packed drifts. Clay staggered to his feet, revolver heavy in his grip, vision blurring at the edges with exhaustion and cold. He could see Captain Bronson's silhouette emerging from the glare, coat flapping, her voice ringing with commands, her team fanning out in tight formation, guns drawn and eyes sharp. The chaos of the fight seemed suspended for an instant. Sable stood guard over Benji, fur spattered with blood, eyes burning with pain and determination. The boy clung to the dog's neck, too stunned for tears. Nearby, one of the kidnappers lay face down in the snow, groaning, the other pressed up against the loader, hands raised in surrender as Bronson's deputies surrounded him. But the third man, the driver, was gone, vanished into the trees with a speed born of terror. For a few seconds, Clay considered giving chase, but every instinct told him to stay, to guard the child, to make sure nothing else was taken from this night. The radios buzzed, voices urgent, "Area secure! Suspects down! Requesting medical at logging camp!" And for the first time, Clay let the revolver drop, his hands shaking so hard he could barely tuck it back in his belt. The adrenaline left him hollow, chest aching with the aftershock. Bronson reached him first, eyes searching his face, her expression a mixture of relief and barely restrained fury. "What the hell happened, Clay?" she barked. But her hands went gently to Benji, checking him for injuries, pulling him close into the warmth of her coat. Clay opened his mouth, but words wouldn't come. Instead, he knelt beside Sable, running his hands over the dog's battered body, feeling for wounds, whispering a single wordless prayer of gratitude. Sable licked the back of his wrist, a gesture almost tender, then slumped heavily into his lap. The dog was shaking, but alive. Ambulances arrived, medics flooding the scene, lights pulsing against the white expanse. Benji was lifted gently onto a stretcher, bundled in blankets, his eyes never leaving Sable's until the very last moment. The medics coaxed Clay to his feet, wrapping him in a thick thermal sheet. Every muscle ached. His head buzzed with the noise of radio static, voices, the heavy stomp of boots. For the first time, he realized how many people had come. Half the town, it seemed, drawn by the news of the rescue, of a miracle at the edge of the woods. Amidst the confusion, Bronson pulled Clay aside. "We found something," she said, her voice low. She handed him a small battered phone, the same model he'd found in the sedan but newer, its message thread still open. "Will D. Everything ready. Midnight. You promised my mom would be safe. Slade. Do your job. No loose ends, no police. Clay stared, pulse thumping. Will Drummond, the rookie, the officer with nervous eyes and mud on his cuffs, the one Sable had never trusted. Bronson's jaw clenched. We traced the calls. He's the inside man, Clay. Slade had leverage. Will's mother is in the hospital, stage 4 cancer, insurance gone. Slade threatened to cut her off, threatened worse. He used him. A heaviness pressed down on Clay, a knot of pity, anger, and something close to understanding. Will, caught between desperation and fear, had tried to play both sides, to save his mother and himself, and in the end, nearly lost everything. But the consequences were real. The pain radiated outward, touching every life in the circle. Will was found hours later, wandering in shock on the outskirts of town. He didn't resist arrest. He wept as they handcuffed him, voice ragged with apology, repeating over and over, I'm sorry, I just wanted her to live." Bronson watched in silence, her eyes bright with tears she wouldn't let fall. Raymond Slade, the man with the scar, was cuffed and loaded into a cruiser. As he passed Clay, their eyes met, an exchange cold as the grave. Clay saw the emptiness there, the kind that comes from a lifetime of breaking things you never learned to value. The rest of the night passed in a blur of paperwork, lights, questions, and the dull, stunned relief that settles after catastrophe. Sable was stitched up at the vet's office, his wounds cleaned and bandaged. Benji was reunited with his parents at the hospital, their sobs of gratitude echoing in the fluorescent-lit halls. Dawn finally arrived, washing the pines with pink and gold. Clay leaned against the railing outside the hospital, Sable at his feet, both watching the slow, uncertain rebirth of hope in the faces of the townspeople as they gathered, offering coffee, blankets, quiet words of thanks. Captain Bronson joined him, her posture tired but unbowed. "You did good," she said softly. "We all did." Clay closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the rising sun thaw something old and stubborn inside him. For the first time since Minnesota, he felt the ache begin to ease just a little, and in that fragile peace he realized there were things that could be saved, even in the coldest winter. The morning after the rescue, Truckee was changed. Snow still blanketed the town in its cold hush, but beneath it, something had shifted. A hush less of fear, more of awe. As if even the mountains themselves were waiting to see what hope looked like after so many silent winters. Clay Henderson walked the familiar streets with Sable limping gently at his side. The shepherd's flank wrapped in fresh gauze. The town was quieter than usual, but not in the old way. Now, when doors opened, faces appeared, relieved, grateful, even tender. People who had once turned away now nodded in the street, pausing to offer coffee or a shy handshake. Small kindnesses layered themselves over old wounds. The Salazar family was the first to find Clay that morning. Benji's mother pulled him into a wordless embrace, tears freezing on her cheeks. Benji clung to Sable, burying his face in the dog's ruff, not speaking, but not letting go. Clay's own chest tightened, some old crack in him loosening as he watched the boy, saw the hope and innocence that might have been lost, but wasn't. For once, it was enough just to witness. Sable became a legend overnight. Children hung drawings of him on the station's bulletin board, crayon portraits of a heroic dog standing guard over snowy woods, with a blue parka by his side. Volunteers gathered at the school to build a new fence around the playground. and Clay found himself pressed into service helping to install security cameras, sturdy locks, better lights along the forest's edge. These were small things, but in towns like Truckee, small things were the difference between fear and belonging. At the station, Captain Bronson gathered her officers for a quiet meeting. There was no big speech, no ceremony, but every face was changed by the ordeal, humbled, a little softer. Bronson shook Clay's hand, holding his gaze longer than before. "You trusted your gut," she said. "Not everyone would have listened. I'm glad you did." There was healing, too, in the way the town treated Will Drummond. He faced the consequences of his actions, a suspension, an investigation, a hard reckoning with the hurt he'd helped cause. But Bronson insisted on counseling, not condemnation. The truth of his desperation, the threat against his mother, rippled through the community in waves of shock and complicated compassion. Will's mother received help from neighbors and old friends, a meal train starting up. Envelopes with cash slipped under her door. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but in the quiet that followed, it felt possible. Days passed and Sable grew stronger, the bandages slowly coming off. He followed Clay everywhere, through the station, down Main Street, to the edge of Donner Lake where the wind carried the sharp, clean smell of pine. Each day, Clay felt himself thaw, the tightness in his chest loosening, the world growing less gray, more blue and gold. He found comfort in the routines, the warm mug in his hands before sunrise, the weight of Sable's head on his knee, the laughter of children echoing over new-fallen snow. One morning, Benji and his mother came to the station, bringing a small wooden box tied with blue ribbon. Inside was a collar for Sable, painstakingly painted, a silver tag engraved with the word Guardian. Benji slipped it over the shepherd's head, his hands trembling with quiet pride. Sable stood tall, tail wagging slowly, head bowed in gratitude. Clay watched the scene unfold, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the winter sun. For a long time, he had believed he'd never belong anywhere again, that grief and loss were permanent homes, that some wounds could not be mended. But in these small acts, the touch of a hand, the wag of a tail, the open door, he began to see a different story written for him, and for the dog who had come so far to find his own redemption. In the evenings, Clay and Sable would return to the small cabin above the grocery store. Clay kept the note that had warned him, "Don't trust everyone." The woods hide more than snow, pinned above his desk, a quiet reminder of how quickly danger could creep in, how vigilance was both shield and burden. But the fear that had once filled the walls was softer now, replaced by a steady, growing peace. On weekends, Clay opened his living room to the children of Truckee, teaching them survival basics. How to find north in the woods, how to make noise when lost, how to trust their instincts. Sable, still the silent hero, lay in the center of the circle, letting small hands ruffle his ears, his presence a comfort and a promise. Night after night, as the lights flickered on in town and the hush of new snow fell, Clay realized the pain he carried might never disappear completely. But it no longer owned him. There was life and laughter, and a sense of being needed, no longer a stranger among strangers, but a man with roots, a dog with purpose, a town learning to heal. And under the wide, patient sky, hope began to take root in the places where sorrow once ruled. Winter loosened its grip on Truckee by inches, the white hills slowly melting back to pine and rock as the sun lingered longer in the sky. Yet in the hearts of its people, the change had come far faster. What happened in the forest? What Clay and Sable had risked and endured had become more than story. It was woven into the everyday fabric of town life, quiet but ever present, like the hush of new snow at dawn. Clay Henderson had stopped thinking of himself as a stranger. Each morning began with a walk through the thawing streets, Sable at his side, his new guardian tag catching the sun. People greeted them by name. At the coffee shop, regulars would ask for stories, sometimes about the rescue, more often about the dog. Children rushed up with mittened hands to pet Sable's ears, to trace the line of the old scar near his flank, as if by touching it they could keep fear at bay. At the edge of the elementary schoolyard, Clay found a new rhythm. He and Sable started a program for the children, one part wilderness survival, one part gentle reassurance. The kids learned how to read the clouds for coming snow, how to spot the subtle tracks of deer and fox, how to make a whistle from pine bark if ever they wandered too far. Sable, once haunted and wary, blossomed under their attention, his tail swishing through each lesson like a quiet promise that safety was never out of reach. Some days Clay caught glimpses of Benji watching from the fence, his blue parka a bright point in the crowd, his laughter quick and bright. It reminded Clay of something he'd almost forgotten, the ordinary courage it takes for a child to walk into the world again after being lost. Captain Bronson, changed by what had happened, pushed for reforms with a new urgency, more lighting along the wooded trails, better coordination between town and rangers, and most of all, a renewed belief in listening to those who see what others overlook, be it a quiet officer from out of state or a rescue dog who could not let the past go. She never made a speech about it, but Clay saw it in her choices. How she visited Will Drummond's mother in the hospital, how she gave Will work in the evidence room after his suspension ended, trusting that grace, not punishment, would break the cycle of fear. Clay himself, who once believed that sorrow was his only inheritance, found that routine, especially when shared, could soften the sharpest edges. He kept his living room open every weekend for the children's club. Sable sprawled in the center, eyes half closed as stories and laughter spun around him. He found joy in small things, the scent of baking bread from the market below, the feel of spring mud under his boots, the way the mountain light caught in Sable's amber eyes at dusk. Sometimes in the quiet moments, Clay would remember Minnesota, the life that was, the wife whose memory lingered in a photograph above his desk. The ache had not vanished. But it lived beside other things now. Gratitude, a sense of purpose, the slow, patient growth of trust. He understood finally that loss was not something to outrun. It was something to invite in, to let it teach you how much there still was to give. Sable's scars faded beneath his thickening fur, but never fully disappeared. Children traced them anyway, inventing legends about his bravery, how he had battled wolves or chased away the darkness at the edge of the world. Clay never corrected them. He knew better than most that sometimes the truth hides itself in myth so that we will remember to hope. The town honored Clay and Sable with a plaque on the station wall. For courage, for faith, for the quiet work of guardians. But what mattered more were the less public things. A thank you whispered on the street, a plate of cookies left on Clay's stoop, the sight of Sable curled up on the porch of the school, sentinel and friend. And so life unfolded, day after day, a little brighter, a little softer. Truckee was not without danger, nor sorrow. But it was no longer haunted by fear. The children played beneath the pines, The adults watched over one another with new vigilance, and every morning, Sable made his rounds, a silent promise that no child would ever feel alone in those woods again. Clay walked with him, their steps in quiet unison. He had learned, slowly, sometimes painfully, that redemption did not arrive all at once, but in slow accumulations, a smile, a handshake, a town finding its way back to itself. And if, on the edge of dusk, he sometimes thought he saw shadows lingering between the trees, he did not turn away. He stood with Sable, both of them scarred, both of them whole, watching as the night gathered and believing, finally, that together they could meet whatever darkness might come. Sometimes what saves a town isn't power or force, but the unwavering loyalty of a dog and the quiet resolve of a person who chooses, day after day, to do the right thing, even when no one is watching. If you've ever been changed by the love or bravery of a dog, or found hope again when you thought you'd lost your way, share your story in the comments below. And if this story touched you, like and subscribe for more real stories of courage and second chances. Who knows, maybe the next guardian is already waiting just outside your door.